Deze podcast is powered by ACC ICT, de nummer 1 Kubernetes specialist van Nederland.
Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van de Nederlandse Kubernetes Podcast. De podcast over Kubernetes voor iedereen. Ik ben Ronald Kers en ik zit zoals altijd met...
Jan Stomphorst.
Oh, Jan Stomphorst.
Ja, dat is nieuw hè?
Ja.
Hey, we zitten hier op DevWorld. In niet een glazen koepel, maar glazen huis.
Ja, nee, vorig jaar waren we ook op DevWorld en daar hadden we zeg maar de Space Station, om het maar even zo te zeggen, van plastic. Nu zitten we in een glazen huis. Nee, echt weer een toplocatie, top talks. Mooi event weer dit jaar.
Ja, zeker. En we hebben een hele speciale gast.
Een hele speciale gast zelfs.
Ja.
Nou, dan zou ik het publiek niet langer in verwachting laten.
Hij heeft ons niet verstaan.
Goed. Ik hoorde dat hij uit Duitsland komt, dus dat zou vast wel goed komen. Anyway, it's Harry Kimpel. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great that you join us in the podcast. And I saw you're a Principal Developers Relations Engineer at New Relic.
Yes.
That's
a mouthful.
That's a mouthful, yeah. Oh, yeah.
What does that mean?
It just means that I have a technical background. I can talk a little bit about code, which I've done for many years, and try to translate this into, useful things for the audience and for the community.
Oh, nice.
That's in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's your background in the IT? How did you get started? If I turn on the Wayback Machine, what will just...
So, if you turn on the Wayback Machine, you would go way, way back. I mean, I'm coming up on 50 years, and I started in, software or, computers when I was 14. I bought my first Commodore Amiga 500 back then. And of course, I have two brothers. We played games, all of the games, right? But what fascinated me was the fact that, back then you had magazines that printed source code, and I typed it into the Amiga and played around with it. And I was like, I was flashed, right? I mean, then that was it. I wanted to learn more. I studied computer science at some point, and that's, I'm still here, coding away in all various kinds of languages, and this is what I am passionate about. Yeah.
Okay, and do you have a favorite language?
So, due to my background, I like C#. I worked in the Microsoft developer ecosystem quite a bit. Don't judge me for that, but
we won't.
It's I started in Visual Basic 3 and 4, right? And then got into ASP and ASP.NET and C# and but I used many different languages over the course of the time. Very much Go, Python, Java as well. But when you talk about what is the favorite, it's C#.
Okay. Oh, nice. So now you have a talk here at DevWorld, tracing event-based systems with OpenTelemetry. Can you tell us a little bit about your talk? What is it about?
For sure. So the talk is all around basically using OpenTelemetry as an open standard. I'll talk a little bit about what OpenTelemetry is, where it came from, and how you can use it in a very open way. I'm coming from the Relic, but the purpose of my talk is to share the knowledge in how to use OpenTelemetry, how to get started. And especially,
my question is then, what is OpenTelemetry?
Right. So I'm from the Relic, right? I mentioned it. And so we have been in the application performance monitoring quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Started in 2008. And this was something that flashed my mind when I first used it, right? You could use an agent, attach it to your applications without changing your source code. And then you get so many insights about what is happening inside of the application, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
And this is great and has been great for many years. Yep. But the problem with that is our New Relic agents, they are very much focused on the New Relic platform. Yep. You cannot use them with any other observability vendor, right? And this is where OpenTelemetry comes into play as an open standard of how to capture data telemetry from your applications, metrics, logs, traces. And traces is one of the types of data that you can collect from your applications that I will be mainly focusing on in the talk.
Yeah. Okay, and what kind of traces does it capture then?
So typically what you want to learn, especially if you have multiple services talking to each other, you have a service A, talks to service B, talks to some database. You want to understand not only is one of these services having an issue, excuse me, but the entire trace, all the way from maybe your user interaction, end user interaction in the front end, in the mobile app, to talking to the first backend service, to another service. So this entire chain of execution is typically something really complicated to understand what is happening. And when we talk about tracing, we want to capture information from the very beginning all the way to the end. And this is where traces are really nice because they inject something into these requests, whether you're using HTTP or gRPC. And when you talk from one service to another service, OpenTelemetry and the tracing aspect will automatically inject something. It's kind of like magic, right? But then at the end of the day, if you then collect all this data, all these traces, you can then provide these typical waterfall views on the entire trace took 7 seconds, and how does it break down into the different parts of your entire request.
So if I have a web server with a database and a web application, and I've got a user, how does it work then?
So basically, behind the scenes, what happens is if you have let's keep that example. You have an HTTP request from service A to service B. Mm-hmm. What OpenTelemetry or the tracing aspect does is it injects a trace context into this request. So as part of the header, when you talk from service A to service B, it will inject this trace context, and this is based also on open standard, W3C based. So this will be injected on the one hand on the service that makes the request to the other service, and then service B tries to find this context as part of the interaction. If it captures or identifies such a trace context, it will continue that trace from that on. If it doesn't, it will start a new trace, right? But the whole idea is that you can send data, like some metadata, some information from one service to another, and then be able to stitch it back together at the end and to find out, where was it slow? Why was it slow? Did we see any issues or exceptions?
Okay, cool. And how... where does it got? Is better question. Just keeping my words in order. Where do you store that data?
So you can start by storing it in your console, right? You can output it into your console and look at all the information there, which will be a little bit hard, especially if you have multiple traces being output. So typically what happens is you will send it to some backend that has some intelligence to, stitch all the things together. Imagine you have like different, pieces, and, you have a parent and a sub trace and so on and so forth. And so somehow you need to stitch it all together and then visualize it in a human, capturable way, right? Yeah. And so you can, of course, use some other open source tools, like Jaeger is the most popular one that you can use to, send the data to the Jaeger and then visualize that piece of information. Or you can use any kind of, observability backend, Relic, Datadog, Dynatrace, others to use and send the data there. And they will then do also, visualize the data in a meaningful way for the end user.
Is this also different than the standard New Relic tooling? Because I know New Relic a bit, and you implement also a package in your application. Is that different, or is it roughly the same?
It is pretty much the same. Another core concept that OpenTelemetry also brings is this OpenTelemetry Collector that you can also use to send the data into this collector that typically runs, in your Kubernetes cluster, for example, as one of the parts. And then you can send the data locally to your OpenTelemetry Collector running inside of your own environment on-prem. And then the advantage is that you can then do some processing on the data before you send it off to some observability backend. Or you can then decide, I want, my metrics to go here, my traces to go somewhere else, my logs, again.
So OpenTelemetry does not only do traces, but also does metrics. And what kind of metrics does it?
the typical metrics from your, systems that you use, the CPU, the memory usage from your JVMs or from your services, but also very much metrics from any other services. Like in my talk, I'm talking about event-based systems. So, for example, if you're using Kafka from your Kafka brokers, you can also send in metrics. And the idea is that you collect all the information so that you then have like a single context to look at in the case of an issue, right?
Yep.
I have an exception. Where's the root cause of my issue? To quickly find out where the problem is. And that's the whole purpose. Yeah.
Okay.
So Kafka, what is Kafka?
So Kafka is one of the event-based systems that I'm using. It basically is used to decouple services from another, right? So one service could send in some messages into Kafka as an event system, and the other one could, in his own terms, then decide, hey, I want to retrieve messages from this system and then process it.
It's an event bus.
I'm sorry?
An event bus.
An event bus, basically, yeah.
Right. I also heard a couple of examples in the past of new systems that were coming up. There was specifically a game server that was spin up, and they were collecting a lot of telemetry data, and it caused an overload on the systems. Is that something that, how do you keep that in check? If you collect a lot of telemetry, you get a lot of data.
Yeah.
And you can get a lot of overload on the systems and the connections.
Yeah.
Is that how can you prevent, of how do you manage that?
And to be honest, the data from your telemetry that you capture can be way more than the data that you have within your application, right? Your business data. And so if you use your own environment to capture this telemetry, then of course you have to also measures in place on how to make sure that your system that receives this telemetry is also up and running. So you need to make sure that this is up and running, has enough disk space, and so on. And that's where, for example, we at Relic come into play to provide this as a managed service, right? We scale behind the scenes. We make sure that you can always send in data, and we ingest a crazy amount of data into our platform. But basically, that's the whole purpose, right? That you don't need to deal with these kind of topics in your own environments. Yeah.
Kost het beheer van Kubernetes je veel tijd en expertise? Maak kennis met ACC ICT. Zij ontzorgen je volledig met managed Kubernetes diensten op elke cloud. Gecertificeerde specialisten zorgen voor compleet beheer, 24/7 support en optimale beveiliging. Jij kunt je focussen op je core business, terwijl je Kubernetes-omgeving in betrouwbare handen is. Managed Kubernetes van ACC ICT. Jouw zorg, onze expertise. Bezoek accict.com.
If you want to start with OpenTelemetry, so I'm new to OpenTelemetry. I've got nothing.
Yeah.
And I just want to start.
Yes.
Do I have to do a lot?
It depends.
There it is.
Always.
It's a running gag at this point. It depends.
But I want to do, of course, tracing.
Yes. Yeah. So, for example, OpenTelemetry comes with basically two different approaches, which is also part of the talk tomorrow. One is the so-called zero code way of doing it. Basically, you attach an agent to your application. So, for example, imagine a Java service.
Yeah.
You attach a Java agent at when you start up your JVM, and this will then automatically inject things into your bytecode that is happening. And so in this way, you don't need to change your source code. You just attach the agent, send the data to your console as an output, and then you have already visibility into this. The docs in OpenTelemetry, if you go to opentelemetry.io, the docs are really amazing. They did a great job in getting started with many different languages. So they have typically a getting started guide. Hey, do this. The easy way to set up and get up and running is by using an agent. And that's the reason why I said it depends, right? Because then typically at the second step, you will then go deeper into your services. Maybe I need to find out more of what is happening in my service. Maybe the so-called instrumentation stops at some point, but you need to get further visibility. And this is where you then get into more manual mode, maybe using the SDKs and the APIs of OpenTelemetry.
So But if I want to see a complete trace,
Yes.
like in the example, I've got a web server, a client, and a database.
Yes.
And I just install OpenTelemetry, the agent, and then I'll get complete traces.
You just attach the agent, you define where to send the data to,
Yeah?
and then you're done. And then you get up and running in a couple minutes, and you have a lot of visibility into your services, how your service one talks to another service, talks to a database, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll get the APM and the APM monitoring.
Basically, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. And so I've got OpenTelemetry, just keeping it clear. That will send. I will send that to Jaeger, and I will use Grafana for graphing.
Yes. Yeah. That's perfectly fine. You can do that. You can visualize the data in various kinds of tools. Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing that.
And it's suitable, I assume, for the hyperscalers. It's also for on-premise.
So yeah, the whole purpose is that you can run this on-premise. You can run this OpenTelemetry Collector again wherever it makes sense for you. We have customers who use multiple sets of these collectors. Basically, if you have different regions that you're using for your applications, they have in every region one of these collectors running to send the data to this collector and then do some processing and then send the data, the telemetry off to some backend. But yes, you can run it on your laptop, basically. Yeah.
Oh, nice. So how do you integrate the agent in a Kubernetes environment? Is that like, does it run besides the container as a sidecar, or how does that work?
So typically the agent will run inside of your container as part of your application, right? So
as part of it.
Yeah. But then, of course, the next question is, how can I gather more information about my Kubernetes cluster, right? Some telemetry from my Kubernetes cluster, the nodes that are running, some node metrics, and so on. And all of this is also possible. But then you would basically maybe run a daemon set as part of this to gather data from your nodes and from your infrastructure.
So is that a different agent then, or on your node is an agent, and then your pod is an agent, and then your container is
always a different agent? Yes.
Different agents. All right.
It's not using Prometheus?
You can also use Prometheus. Yes. You have a broad set of choices, in my opinion. And again, it depends on what is the best use case. How does it best fit into your environment? Maybe you're not starting from scratch, right? You already have some of your applications already exposing Prometheus metrics. The easiest way is to gather these metrics.
And how? For example, I've got that Prometheus running in my Kubernetes cluster. Do I import that in OpenTelemetry, or do I import it in Jaeger, or where does it go?
So ideally, in my opinion, the best approach is to basically, if you want to follow the standard of OpenTelemetry, right, you would be able to retrieve these Prometheus metrics from your services. Mm-hmm. OpenTelemetry does have some capabilities to what's the right word? Not retrieve.
Just pull? Pull the information? Or?
Yeah, you basically the polling. I'm looking for a different word.
What's the German word? Maybe it's the same as the Dutch word.
That's the hard part as well. Like German words for English IT is always. Maybe it comes to my mind. But basically, you would be able to talk to this Prometheus endpoint, retrieve the data, and then maybe do some post-processing.
Does OpenTelemetry do the processing, or does Jaeger do the processing?
So Jaeger could be one of the endpoints that you send the data then to, right? In my opinion, I would start very pragmatic, use the OpenTelemetry collector, retrieve the metrics into the collector, and then decide what do you want to do with it. Do you want to send the metrics into, visualizing Grafana? Maybe you want to, send the traces to Jaeger. You have the choice and the freedom to do whatever you want with the configuration. But the purpose is that you're using an open standard, right? Maybe you have also different environments. Maybe you're in a dev and QA environment. You have different approaches, but you use the same concept behind the scenes, even for your production. But in production, you send the data off to like an observability backend or to some other system, but you're following the same approach in your different environments, and that's also a nice benefit.
Yeah,
nice.
that's cool. And you said processing. Well, in my view, what are we processing? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's various kinds of processing that you can do. For example, you can batch the data and not send like every piece that you collect right off to some other system.
Okay.
So you can batch it and send it off in maybe in chunks. But another example is, maybe your developers decided to send in debug logs into the collector.
Yeah.
You can decide debug logs. We will not send the debug logs out to some system because that will, fill up our disk space. So you can say, hey, debug logs, we're dropping directly. Or, and maybe last example, you may have collected some PII data, right? I mean, we are in Europe, right? We are very sensitive of data collection. Mm-hmm. So if you collected some PII data, some personal information, some credit card data, you can also decide what do you want to do with that data. You can run some regular expressions on that type of data, maybe obfuscate it, drop it again, or do some post-processing, maybe hashing it, or some other forms of processing.
Cool. So we can change the data in OpenTelemetry based on rules we give it and make it anonymous.
Yes, for example, yeah.
Ah, nice.
That's awesome.
And in your LinkedIn bio, you also said you are quite familiar with customer insights. Can you share like a customer story? Because why they implemented and what they solved?
Right. So one of the examples is, I'm always very much excited when I talk to developers on how easy it is to get started, right? And many developers, they didn't start with like tracing. They very much maybe looked into logs because that's what they're most familiar with. But giving a developer an easy way to get up and running with like in my example, the event-based system, right? You're maybe having a Kafka in between service A and service B. And OpenTelemetry has built-in support to capture the entire trace all the way from the beginning to the end, even if you have some form of event-based system in between. And so one of the customers, they used it, they got like visibility into this entire trace where more, in previous situations, they may have more, isolated or siloed pieces of data that they needed to stitch together. And so having that visibility into a complete end-to-end perspective was really key for them to get up and running and make sure that everything is working as expected.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. Anything to add, Jan?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. So we always have a final question. And that is, how do you see the future of Kubernetes? And of course, you can broaden it up a little bit with the new Relic in there. But what's your opinion?
I wouldn't go into like the dependency between New Relic and Kubernetes, but basically, in my opinion, all of the managed services from the hyperscalers, like AKS, EKS, and so on, they make it easier for people to get started. I mean, I had a rough time when I started in Kubernetes, like setting up some systems. But the challenge starts then when you try to get this into production, right, in the real production scenario. And I think what all of the hyperscalers enabled is kind of like making sure that you maybe abstract some pieces of it away from you to, allow you to be more agile, to be more flexible, and to be more production ready. And I think, I hope we see more abstraction when it comes to Kubernetes, maybe, making it even easier for customers to use it, because it is, it is hard to, run Kubernetes in production at scale.
That makes it fun.
Yeah, it makes it fun. Yeah. Keeps us busy, right?
Yeah, right.
Some people forget that what you do on Kubernetes, you also have to do on non-Kubernetes systems.
Yep.
And they forget that we have to do that. And the problem with Kubernetes, they push you in the right way. You have to do it.
You have to start thinking about different concepts, right, on how to scale various parts of your application.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I think I'm biased. I think it's awesome. But thank you. Thank you for the insights.
Harry, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to speaking to you next time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was great to, be speaking to you. Yeah.
Thanks. Cool. See ya.
Thank you.
Yep.
Done.
Deze podcast is een initiatief van ACC ICT en wij zijn te beluisteren op onze website k8spodcast.nl via Spotify, Apple en alle andere favoriete podcastproviders.